Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. The dishonest and risky behavior of investors on Wall Street helped push our country deep into a recession. The toxic trash being traded by investors still pose a very real threat and very dangerous threat to the finances of people who aren't even involved in the stock market. I have attorney Mike Berg with me now to talk about Wall Street and its big gamble. Mike, it's pretty amazing. The American public listened to the burn down about Cyprus. They heard the stories about the banks actually taking their life savings to pay off the banks that had involved themselves with conduct just like we saw in America. So where you had somebody who had their life savings in a Cyprus bank, it was reduced by 30, as high as 40% in some instances, where the bank simply took their money. Americans sat and watched that story and have no clue, had zero clue that this is set up exactly the same in the United States with the new legislation that they don't even know about. They have no idea that Dodd-Frank gives a bank no option. The new Dodd-Frank bill tells the American public that taxpayers are not going to bail a bank out anymore, right? So if the taxpayer doesn't bail the bank out, what ends up happening is the same thing that happens in Cyprus. The rules in the United States allow exactly that to happen, and most Americans don't understand it. Did I get that right?
You did, Mike. And I think what the tragedy here is they put these super banks, these super giant mega banks ahead of the depositors. The only place they can get the money if they run out of money or they get involved with these derivatives, which we know they're doing, is to get the money from the depositors. And that's not only the individual depositors, but there are banks, little banks around the country that use those banks for deposits. So really, this could be a domino effect that could be so devastating it could wipe out deposits across the United States.
Okay, let me set this up just so the viewers understand exactly how serious this is. There's two parts to it, but the two major parts. The first part is the 2005 Bankruptcy Act, which says that you have derivative claims that have a superior position over all the other claimants. In other words, if there's a derivative scam that takes place, there's investors in that derivative, maybe out of Wall Street, maybe out of LA, wherever the investors are, those derivative claimants get their money first, okay? Not the people who have money deposited in that bank. That happened, people didn't even understand what the significance of that was, but it's a superposition that these people have. The next part of it, obviously, is 716, Section 716 of the Dodd-Frank bill. Explain what the problem is there.
Well, the problem is, and you hit it right on the head, which is, first of all, let me also say you were absolutely correct. In these derivatives, it's generally other big banks that are involved in the derivatives, who are the investors. So what they're doing is you really have, you have the fox guarding the hen house. So when they made the change to the bankruptcy law, it was to protect themselves. Now we go to the priority in terms of how we now, under Dodd-Frank Act, as to what happens. Well, we can't go to the taxpayers anymore, and they have a super priority. So if they have and they need the money, they're going to go and get it out of the depositors and the money that people have put in their bank as their savings.
Okay, Mike, let me throw one other thing out that it should be startling. If you have money in a bank right now and you're listening to this broadcast, and this doesn't cause you concern, then somehow you simply aren't paying attention. Here's the third part of the problem. The third part of the problem is that the FDIC only has $25 billion available to pay off the claims. And right now, the numbers are into the multi-trillions of dollars if the same thing repeats as far as bank failures because of CDOs, derivatives, swaps, synthetics. If we have that same kind of failure, we have a situation to where it is multi-trillions of dollars that the depositors are at risk. The depositor in the bank down the road, that those people are at risk, and the FDIC only has the capacity for $25 billion. That should scare the hell out of people, shouldn't it?
Well, the numbers I've seen are over $200 trillion are at risk.
Right.
You compare that to 25 billion, I mean, it's a small percentage of it. And I must say, what's going on here is what we've all talked about previously, and what's the most scary part is we now have the big banks and the corporations and the big banks here controlling government. And getting, basically, they're going to be insulated, and yet the individual depositors are going to have to pay the price. If unfortunately, we see what happened in 2007, 2008 happens again, and it's going to happen.
Well, I hate to be flippant about this, but these very same people, a lot of the same people who thought that politics doesn't matter, that it doesn't make any difference who's elected, that if you take a corporatist Democrat and put him in office, he's going to be just great, everything's going to be okay, that didn't make any difference. Well, look what this president has done to this country. Look what the corporatist Democrats have done to the country. Obviously, just the same thing we would have seen from Mitt Romney. There is no difference. But the truth is, we don't have any Glass-Steagall protection. Explain how Glass-Steagall might have protected us, and now it doesn't.
Well, in 1933, after the Great Depression, the Congress was smart enough and the president was smart enough to pass Glass-Steagall, which said, banks, you are just banks. You can only lend money. You can do what banks do. You can't invest in things. Of course, there were no derivatives until the 80s, but you couldn't invest. You couldn't go into derivatives. You couldn't be in an insurance business. You were a bank. And then during the Clinton administration in 1982, that was rescinded. And now banks became these too big to fail, too big to go to jail. They were in a position where they were doing everything. And we saw what happened in 2007, 2008, 2009, where over $7 trillion was lost, and the taxpayers around the world have had to come in, and in Cyprus, the depositors, the actual people who had money in the bank, had to come in to bail out these banks because of their greed and their failure to recognize the risk of what they were doing.
Day one, the Cyprus depositor had $100,000 that they thought that they could use as retirement. Day two, it was reduced by $30,000. That's basically a typical kind of scenario.
Yeah. Mike, I think I said 1982. I meant 1992.
Yes,
when Glass-Steagall was rescinded, and I apologize.
Well, here's the problem, Mike. It is that the apology you just made is interesting in that the average American has so little information that they don't even know enough to apologize for their lack of information. In other words, if you take a look at 716, Section 716 on Dodd-Frank, you had the President of the United States and the media selling Dodd-Frank like this is going to be great for Americans, and nobody asked the question, wait a second. Dodd-Frank says that taxpayers may not bail out banks. They couldn't put that together with the 2005 Bankruptcy Act and understand that the FDIC only had $25 billion. And when you add all those together, there's no question about who's going to be responsible in the failure. If you think your money is safe and you understand that $200 trillion is at risk here because of the swap and derivative industry, you see what's getting ready to happen to you in the next failure. What do people do, Mike? I mean, there's no easy solution, but if you're trying to protect your money, what can you do?
Well, there's only a few things you can do. One is you can put your money in, for example, in North Dakota, they only put the money in the state banks. So they're not going into these mega banks that are Wall Street banks that are involved in derivatives. The second thing you can do, and I must tell you that the Canadians, they've got it right here. They have regulations against banks investing in these derivatives. We need Glass-Steagall to come back.
But that'll never happen. You have a president that doesn't want it to happen. You have a president right now, Mike, that is so tied into Wall Street, he could not care less. And just to follow up with what you're saying, you've got J.P. Morgan alone controls 30% of all this toxic trash. And if you have money with J.P. Morgan, it's caveat emptor. You know that something's going to happen. It's going to be your loss.
But what they must do, Democrats, Republicans, it doesn't matter. You must go and really go to Congress. You got to call them. You got to write the congressman. You got to tell them, look, you know what? The entire economy is at risk.
Mike,
we need regulation.
There's been great stories written about that very issue. I just beg to differ with you. The story is we are in a plutocracy right now, and right now money controls all of that. It used to be letter campaigns, angry campaigns would change things. Now you have that congressman or that senator, Democrat and Republican, who only responds to money, unfortunately. Now, let me go to the other part of this. The other part is that if you hold municipal bonds, now just think about this. You think you have tax-free municipal bonds, everything's okay, everything's going to be just fine, but what you don't realize is that same municipality also has a lion's share of their money in these same derivatives and toxic trash that just burned down. So when it burns down, that municipality loses, and what happens to the bond, Mike?
Well, basically, it's worthless. And that's what happened in 2007, 2008, 2009. We have states, we have municipalities that have gone bankrupt as a result of their investments in what they thought were safe investments, which were told to them by these giant banks, and they were involved in these derivatives and these CDOs. And what we're looking at, though, is the crisis is not going away like everyone's been told. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, this is exactly what happened in the Clinton years. I mean, Clinton had this, it was all smoke and mirrors, Mike. I mean, Clinton had Wall Street at full tilt, creating toxic trash. You had the Rubin Group, you know, the Geithner, Rubin, Summers, Paulson Group. You had all of those people creating trash, toxic trash. They didn't make anything. They didn't build cars. They didn't build airplanes. They built nothing. They did nothing for this economy except create toxic trash. In about a minute, tell me, are there any differences, and do you see us on the same path in about a minute?
Well, we're on the same path. The names you mentioned, to me, you know, it's funny. People say, you know, Geithner, and they talk about Paul. Goldman Sachs, that's where they came from. They all come from Wall Street. The people who are making the policy are from Wall Street. They have made hundreds of millions of dollars themselves as a result of what they're doing. It's not going to change as long as the President of the United States allows the people who are running the economy to be wedded to Wall Street and have their own financial interests put ahead of that of the country.
And Mike, unfortunately, as I watch this president day to day, I mean, just a year ago, he called Jamie Dimon a genius. Now, Jamie Dimon, as you know, should be, the man should be in handcuffs, but our president called him a genius. That's the sign of the times. Michael Berg, as usual, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
That's it this week on Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.